Welcome to PAR Podcast, episode 75.32. PAR Podcast is an audio supplement for Public Administration Review, the premier professional journal in the field of public administration. This year, 2015, PAR celebrates 75 years of furthering public administration research, theory, and practice. This episode features comments by Michael D. Siciliano, an assistant professor of public administration at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Professor Siciliano discusses his article titled Advice Networks in Public Organizations, the Role of Structure, Internal Competition, and Individual Attributes. This article is currently available on Early View and will be printed in Public Administration Review, Issue 75, Volume 3.
When most people think about an organization, they tend to focus on the formal organizational structure, the bosses, the departments, the project teams. But there's also an informal side to any organization that may be driving its performance. In fact, Rob Cross and his colleagues argue that in today's knowledge-intensive work environment, most work of any importance is heavily reliant on the informal networks of employees. These informal networks cross the boundaries for organizational charts, and they facilitate not only the transmission of work-related knowledge, but facilitate the establishment of new and innovative ideas. Acknowledging the presence of informal networks is nothing new, however. People interested in organizations have long been aware of their importance, and this recognition dates at least back to the Hawthorne studies conducted in the 1920s. Research on informal networks and organizations really took hold in the 1970s and 80s. Much of this work was aimed at understanding the consequences of informal networks on individual and organizational outcomes. Informal networks were seen as repositories of organizational knowledge, culture, belief systems, and the structure of these networks had been empirically shown to impact both individual and organizational performance. So while the impact of informal network structure on a range of outcomes has received a fair amount of attention from organization and management scholars, less emphasis has been placed on the factors influencing the formation of these informal networks, especially within public administration. So in general, it's fair to say that much more is known about the impact of informal networks rather than how or why these networks are forming or emerging in the first place. One of the reasons for this knowledge gap was the lack of suitable methods to analyze networks due to the complex dependencies inherent in their structure. Right. So if you think about traditional linear models, these models assume that each observation and data set is independent of the others. But with network data, that's clearly not true. The observations are linked. Thus, whereas a linear model would treat the dependency as a nuisance to be done away with, for network scholars, the dependency actually becomes a focal point of the analysis. Advances over the past decade in statistical network methodology, especially within this area referred to as exponential random graph models, have allowed scholars to explore various network generating processes, thereby gaining insight into how these networks actually form. Using this class of models to explore informal network structure, my research asked a very simple question. What are the processes by which interpersonal networks emerge in public organizations? I was interested in a specific type of informal network, one that is often referred to as simply the advice network or the instrumental network. These advice networks arise in part due to the complexity and dynamics of the tasks employees face in organizations. It's natural for us as individuals to go seek out and rely on our local colleagues for help and information. And as previous research on the consequences of networks suggests, these advice-seeking behaviors and the advice networks that they eventually form into are important determinants of both individual and organizational success. The data from my research on advice network formation was gathered from public school teachers in 15 different elementary schools, all coming from one mid-sized urban district. The teachers provided information about their informal networks in schools, as well as information related to their self-efficacy, perceptions of internal competition in the school, as well as a range of other attributes. Administrative records provided by the district contain demographic information on the teachers as well. So in thinking about how organizational-wide network structures emerge in these schools, it's really useful to think about the atomic elements of these structures, right? The single dyad in this case. In other words, these dyads are the single advice-seeking tie from one teacher to another. Each of these single ties becomes the outcome of interest. In the paper, I established a simple framework for advice tie formation and then tested a range of variables and factors that may influence the presence or absence of ties between two teachers. The factors that influence tie formation fall into three general categories. The first category concerns the attributes of the advice seeker. So individuals may vary in the propensity to seek information from others, and this may have to do with their own job status, their tenure in the organization, their education, their sense of self-efficacy, as well as their perception of internal competition. The second category concerns the attributes of the advice provider. So like the seeker, providers may be more or less sought out for advice based on their own job status, tenure, education, expertise. And then there's a third category of factors, and this concerns attributes that exist at the dyadic or network level. So at the dyadic level, again thinking about the relationship between two teachers, several processes may be at work. These include homophily, reciprocity, and multiplexity. Homophily captures the tendency for similarity in individual attributes to lead to tie formation. Reciprocity simply measures the tendency for advice relations to be reciprocated, such that if Joe seeks advice from Sally, Sally is in turn more likely to come to Joe for help or advice. Multiplexity is an important concept in the literature on networks, as social relations generally co-occur, or you can think of them as being layered. So for instance, teachers may be friends as well as advice providers. And then beyond these dyadic properties, moving up to the network level or the sub-network level, transitivity is an important factor. Transitivity is related to the famous adage, a friend of a friend is a friend. This adage expresses the idea that ties forming between two individuals can be influenced by broader properties in the network, beyond just the dyad between those two given teachers. So in total, across these three groups of factors, again, these factors were the attributes of the advice seeker, the attributes of the advice provider, and these dyadic and network processes. So across these three groups, 18 different variables were used to model advice tie formation in each of the 15 schools. A statistical network model, known as an exponential random graph model, mentioned earlier, was used to estimate the importance of each of these 18 factors, and then meta-analysis was used on the back end to combine the results across the schools. So this meta-analysis was simply used to provide a single overall combined estimate of the importance or the size of the effect of each of these variables. So given the large number of factors that were explored in this model, I'm only going to stress a few of the results here. So first, and perhaps most importantly, I was interested in teachers' perceptions of peer competition, just sort of how competitive they perceive their internal work environment to be. This was not how competitive they were or how competitive they perceived a given individual to be, but how competitive they felt the internal work environment of their school was. And I was interested in this factor because many of the current managerial strategies used to drive performance and increase accountability rely on motivational incentives that promote this very type of internal competition. While many scholars have theorized that internal competition can hinder collaboration, there is little empirical evidence of its effect. The results of the study suggest that there may indeed be unintended consequences on collaborative behavior when internal competition increases. Specifically, a 1 standard deviation change in a teacher's perception of internal competition in his or her school decreased that teacher's probability of advice tie seeking by 25%. Perception of competition also significantly reduced the likelihood that a teacher provides advice, suggesting perhaps that when competition is high, information provides individuals with a competitive advantage, and therefore they may be less willing to share it. At the dyadic level, significant effects were found for reciprocity, multiplexity, and homophily. The results indicated that reciprocal advice ties were nearly 6 times more likely to form than non-reciprocated ties. With regard to multiplexity, having a friendship tie was also a strong predictor. Teachers who were friends were more than 3 times more likely to form an advice tie than teachers who did not have a friendship tie. Unsurprisingly, with regard to homophily, the results suggested that teachers were more likely to form ties with teachers who taught the same grade. At the network level, or the sort of subgraph level, transitivity also had a positive effect and indicates that 2 teachers were more likely to form an advice tie if they have a tie to a common third person. Overall, the results suggest that teachers rely on mutual relations, transitive relations, friendship, work function similarity when determining advice-seeking behavior, more so than peer status or peer tenure. This finding may mean that there's expertise in the network that is not being fully accessed or utilized. The negative effect of perceived competition, which suggested a negative effect on both the likelihood of being a sender and a receiver of an advice tie, is a potentially worrisome result. If you look at education research, education scholars argue that collaboration and knowledge exchange are critical components in schools because much of what teachers learn about being good teachers is socially derived. It's learned from their local colleagues. Therefore, reduction in collaboration may be particularly harmful in organizational settings like a public school system that are dependent upon shared knowledge. The tentative and suggestive results of the study also have implications for how principals, public managers, and policymakers think about organizational change. These decision makers ultimately shape the culture and norms of an organization through the types of policies they put in place, through their leadership style, their managerial approaches. And so it's essential for these decision makers and organizational leaders to not only recognize that informal networks are important, but to also understand how certain strategies, policies, or tactics can constrain or facilitate the development and functioning of these important informal networks. So my hope is that this study offers a springboard into additional research and interest on the connections between accountability measures, performance-based strategies, and the formation of informal networks. Thanks so much for listening.
This concludes PAR Podcast, episode 75.32. To listen to additional episodes and learn more about Public Administration Review, please visit us online at publicadministrationreview.org. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at PA Review.